Hi, I'm Gary Striegler, and this is the third video of my YouTube series on miter saws, and it's about really getting the best cuts that you can with your miter saw. Now, interestingly enough, a good number of the things that are going to help me to get a really accurate cut, a good miter or a good square cut, are the same sort of things that also lead to safety. But the first thing I want to start with saying is, anytime that I buy tools, anyone asks me, well, what kind of tools should I buy? I tell them, so you probably want to buy something that's maybe, if you looked at all the miter saws that are available, you may not need to buy absolutely the most expensive one, but you probably want to be in that top third to 25%, because you just can't expect a saw that they've had to cut corners on to get the cost down to perform as well as one that they've spent a lot of time engineering to get a really, really great cut. So it's much, much better to kind of stretch a little bit, get the best saw that you possibly can, and then it'll last you for a long time, and you'll be getting a lot of good cuts instead of maybe buying a cheap one and then having to go back and buy a better one later. Of course, the blade is also important. I've shared some about that, but it's the same thing with the blade. You want to spend a good bit of money on a blade. What I generally say is anything from $80, $90 to $150. Get a really, really good blade. And by the way, that good blade is not only going to make better cuts, but it's also going to stay sharp longer. So there's kind of double payback from that. Just take really, really good care of your blade when you use it. Now, one of the things that I've also found, because most of the time we're moving a saw from one spot to another, and so like if I've had a saw in the back of my truck where I take it and set up on a job site, one of the first things that I want to do is I'll just kind of take the saw and make sure it's locked back in. I mean, sometimes, through traveling, they can get to where they're just a little bit off, and so you want to make sure it's locked back in the vertical position if you're going to be making vertical cuts. Now, one thing that I'm not a big advocate of, some people will take the saw, let it hit the detent, and then lock it down. There's no reason in the world to do that. Once you hit a detent, it's not going to move. The reason that you have the ability to lock it down is if you have to override the detent to make a really small adjustment, then you can lock it down. And by the way, that's one of the most important things to me, is the ability to make kind of minute adjustments, to change angles just a little bit to get a really, really good joint. Now, I've shared this in YouTube videos before, but I'm going to say it again. Just generally, the basic way that you check to see, and most saws are pretty accurate out of the box, especially as you're buying those more expensive ones. But one way to see if your saw is cut and squared, take a fairly wide board, make a cut. Now, when you have two pieces, flip one of them over and bring them back together. And when you bring them back together, whatever that space is, you've got the two pieces pushed against the fence, bring them back together. Whatever that space is twice the amount that your saw is out of square. And most of the time, when I take a high quality saw like this and check it, I might have a 32nd of an inch in between those two pieces, which means I'm a 64th out. There's not any way that I'm going to be able to adjust that realistically and get any closer. And you can do the same thing vertically, hold the piece tight, make a cut, flip them over, and check and see how they come together. Now, once you think you've got everything, you made sure it's set back up, you've got everything adjusted, one of the big tips, and this goes just as well for safety, when I get the best cut, the right cut, is when my material's making good contact with the fence and with the bed of the saw. So if I'm cutting a board that has a bow, maybe a bow this direction, I want to make sure I turn it so that the bow is in the middle. If this board was bowed in this direction, I'd want to put it there. If I turned it around like this and it was bowed this direction, as I finished the cut, it would pinch. Same thing vertically. You want to make sure that it's making contact right at the saw blade. Now, an important thing too, to get accurate cuts, is to really hold the piece tight against the fence. And one of the things that can be a problem with that is if you get a little bit of sawdust in here somewhere. I've seen just really the tiniest bit of sawdust mess up a really good cut. So make sure that your table is really, really clean, that you're holding your piece tight. Shared earlier, but if it's a really big piece, make sure that you've got something that supports it out there so you're not struggling to support the piece. Now here's another thing. Most of the time when we're cutting a mitered piece, I'm right-handed, so I am most comfortable cutting like this with my dominant hand. On a piece of baseboard like this, I can flip it upside down. If I need to cut both ends of it, I can make that cut. I can flip around and make that cut. I try to make as many of cuts possible, especially if it's that cut where I'm getting to my final length with on my dominant side. So if I did want to cut both sides of this, I might cut this side first, measure it to length, and then get back over here to the side. It's kind of my dominant side, and make my final cut, my exact cut to length on that side. We talked about the blade a little bit. A lot of people, you hear them call this a chop saw. This isn't a chop saw, it's a miter saw. And a lot of times people are calling it a chop saw, people that just grab it and they just really try and get in a hurry and make the cut too fast, and that can cause blade deflection, and it can also just cause a rough cut. So you want to be taking your time, let the saw blade do its work, and get a great cut that way. Now, often I'll cut something purposefully long and then try and take just that last little bit off to get to exactly the length that I want. And that's how you're going to get your very, very best cut, especially if you happen to be working with hardwoods. A lot of times today we're not working with hardwoods, but when you do get to working with hardwoods, the harder, the more demanding the cut, the more time you want to get the blade to make its cut, and also the more likely you are to get a good cut. If you make one cut and then go back and take just a little bit off with the next cut. One other thing, if you're using a sliding saw, most sliding saws have the ability, like this one is locked in, so it's basically functioning like a non-sliding miter saw right now. And that's what I want to do. All the cuts that I can make with this saw locked in this position, I want to do that. For one thing, they've designed it, this position is where I get the maximum vertical cutting capacity in with this saw, and it's pretty much the maximum horizontal also. So when you make as many cuts as you can with the saw head locked in that position. Of course, if you need to go away from that, then you can use it as a sliding saw. Now, one other thing, often when you're using the saw, you're cutting like flat stock as a sliding saw. If you think about it, when I pull this out and plunge down and push this way, it's going to have a tendency to tear out on the top side. So I would want to put my good face, the face I want to keep, down if at all possible. So it's going to be tearing up if there is any tear out. And most saws, there's going to be on plywood or something, there's going to be a little bit of tear out. So maybe put the face down and let the tear out, if there is any, be on the top side. Now, another thing, every now and then I've seen people, I don't know why they would do this, they might be holding the piece of trim like this. You always want to be holding the flat part of the trim against the flat surface of the saw. And I've even seen people cutting crown mold where they didn't have it hitting the top and bottom fence, they've had it tilted out. Whatever you do, you want to have as good a contact with the saw as possible when you make your cuts. So if you follow these rules, you're going to get great results. There's some other little tricks I want to share when I shoot video on tricks, but it's all about having a good saw with a good blade, taking your time, making a clean cut, making sure that everything is in good contact with the saw, and then as much as possible, try and make your final cuts using your dominant hand where you can see. Last thing, this does have a work light on it, which tells me exactly where the blade's going to cut. Those things are incredibly accurate, and they can help you get really, really good results. So these are great tools. Invest in a good one and you won't be sorry.